Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Sunday morning. Fall is definitely in the air. The leaves are all changing. It's absolutely gorgeous out there right now. So I hope you're taking advantage of that because I'm hearing that we're going to get a little rain in the coming weeks. So get out and enjoy it today. I just have a couple of things to go over. Today is is it capital improvements or our missions? I think it's capital improvements. So you know the drill. You can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, set it up as a one-time gift or a recurring gift. Capital improvements is actually one of the categories on there. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you'd like Pastor Carl or I to come by and pick up a check, we'd be happy to do that too. Our men's group is meeting Monday nights at 6:30 here at the Father's House and on Zoom. Our ladies group is still meeting Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. We're about to finish up our book, so we're kind of looking for something new to do. So if you're interested in joining us, just let me or Deanne know, and we'd love to have you join us. We'll probably take a week or two off because we've got Thanksgiving coming up. We've got Christmas that is right around the corner, if you can believe that. We're going to have our Christmas celebration December 17th here at the Father's House, so we'd love to have you come and be a part of that. I know the worship team's already working diligently to put together something beautiful for you, so we'd love to have you come and join us. That's really all I have to cover today, so we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl.
Well, good morning, Father's House. Glad to be here again. I trust you're having a great day and a great life and a great week. And now we're starting off with a new week, and it's going to be a good one as well. Penny had mentioned that we're going to get some rain here in San Jose next week. It looks like it's going to start, at least what they're saying now is it's going to start on Tuesday and it'll go all the way through Sunday. So it'll be a pretty good sized rain event, or at least there will be the chances of rain for quite a while. So I think she's right. You kind of got to get out and get some walking in, enjoy the sunshine, enjoy the beautiful fall season because it is absolutely gorgeous out there right now. So we couldn't ask for better weather, and I couldn't ask for better friends and better people than you that are joining me and Penny here today on this broadcast. Anyway, what else? Anything else housekeeping-wise? I don't think there's really anything much to do other than Penny and I have just been really busy, but I guess that will never change. And maybe the reason that we're busy is because as I get older, I slow down more. So I can't do as much in a day, so it means that things back up on me. Maybe that's part of the problem. Anyway, it is what it is. I thought we would go further into our study on the life of Jesus, Jesus being of the people. The last couple of weeks, we've really been kind of talking about going back to Jesus at Caesarea Philippi. I won't cover it much. You can go back the last couple of weeks where he asked his disciples in the very seat of idolatry, who do the people say that I am and who do you say that I am? He says that in that very location is where he's taking them, is where he's going to build his church. And that's some interesting and profound or there are some profound theological thoughts in mind when talking about that. You go back and kind of pick up some of those points. And then we talked last week about how you can't separate from that really the Mount of Transfiguration. So on the one hand, we have Jesus saying, "Thou art the Christ," and then Jesus saying that he's going to die, suffer and die. And then Peter, both in that same conversation with him, says, "No, you're not going to die." Jesus rebukes Peter, and then some 6 days later in the narrative, and I think that you've got to keep these narratives together because I think it's very important to see them in their overall context. 6 days later, Luke says 8 days later, that they went up to a mount, and there Jesus was transfigured before their eyes, and he met with Elijah and with Moses, and talking about his departure or his exodus and the things that he must accomplish in Jerusalem. And it's interesting that they're talking about Jesus' departure or Jesus' exodus, because that kind of fits in part and parcel, doesn't it, with the Mosaic move or the Mosaic exodus that we have. And so there's this juxtaposition of Sinai and the Mount of Transfiguration, where Sinai was this place where the Mosaic law was given, and then there you find on this Mount of Transfiguration that you find Jesus, rather than Moses being the one that is shining, presented before the disciples and talking about the things that he's going to accomplish in Jerusalem. And there's a lot of theological richness there that we could talk about, but we're not going to talk about it today, and probably not in the future. That's something that if you wanted to study, you could do that on your own, and you would find it to be a marvelous study. But the parallels are undeniable between Sinai and the Mount of Transfiguration, and even in what we're going to talk about today about coming down from the mountain. Now, remember that when on Mount Sinai, that when Moses was up there for longer than the people thought, that he came down, and as he was coming down to the people, they had created the golden calf. They were worshiping the golden calf, and Moses, if you remember, out of his anger, took the tablets and threw them on the ground and broke the law, the Ten Commandments. He broke the tablets, and in so saying, it says that they even broke the law before the law was established to some extent. And so he had to go back up the mountain after dealing with the situation to get the tablets of stone with the Ten Commandments back on them after that incident. Well, we're going to see a similar thing here in the life of Jesus, as Jesus and Peter, James, and John are coming off the Mount of Transfiguration and coming into a pretty chaotic scene that's happening. Now, I want to say that if you remember when I started talking about when Jesus asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" that when Peter said that he was the Christ, then he knew that they were ready because of their belief in him and their confidence in him, that they were ready now to become disciples and for Jesus Christ to begin to teach them. So the first image that we talked about, or something that needs to always be kept in mind as far as our Christian discipleship, he said, "Blessed are you, Peter, and upon this rock, or upon this truth that he is the Messiah, I'm going to build my assembly. I'm going to build my gathering. I'm going to build my ecclesia." Is when we get the word church, but it really kind of means something different than in modern times of what we think of by way of church. But the idea is that the first image that we have to have about our discipleship and walking as disciples of Christ is the idea that Jesus Christ is the truth, that Jesus is the Messiah, and that he is the true Messiah. And we talked about that in two ways. If you recall, we talked about that word truth basically in this Greek context, or the Greek, in this context in which Jesus lives. It talks about revealing that which is hidden. And so we find Jesus in the book of John early on saying that Jesus was sent to explain the Father to us. And so now for almost 3 years, he's been ministering to the people. But for the first time now, he's beginning to reveal to his disciples that which is hidden about him. So he's beginning to teach them. So he reveals to them, first of all, that he is the truth, that he's the embodiment of truth. And what that means is he's there to reveal himself and reveal the Father and the Father's hearts, actions, moral teachings, way of lifestyle to these disciples that would choose to follow. That becomes very important. So there's the idea of him being the truth and him there to reveal himself. And then at the Mount of Transfiguration, it's important for us to keep in mind the divinity of Christ in this divine mission that he's been called, along with Moses and Elijah, who are already forerunners, and they're done. And now what Jesus is going to ultimately accomplish. So really, we kind of have this idea of, to be a disciple of Jesus Christ is the foundational stone, that he is the truth, and that he reveals the truth. And then also the idea that if any man wishes to be my disciple, he must pick up his cross and follow me, which is the idea then of dying to ourself, which we talked about, self-denial, about caring more about God's will than our own will. The third thing he begins to reveal in teaching them is the idea of his glory. And John talks about that in the Gospel of John, and we beheld his glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. And that's in John, first chapter, verse 14. So it's this idea of that God, in Christ, when he's revealing himself now to the disciples, he's beginning to show not just his earthly ministry, but his heavenly presence, divine presence, or his divine nature, and also the glory of who he is in totality. So after this encounter, they start walking down the mountain. As they're coming down the mountain, we're going to pick up the narrative when there's a mayhem going on with the other 9 disciples that have been left at the foot of the mountain, the scribes and Pharisees and other people that are there, and a man asking for his son to be delivered from a spirit. So we're going to pick this up, and it's in all 3 Gospels, but I want to pick it up in Mark, this time chapter 9, because I think that he probably has more detail than the other accounts do. And so it kind of just says something a little bit different. They all 3 say the same thing, but there's some detail in Mark that I think that becomes very pertinent to us as we think about Christ and his ministry together. So in verse 14 of Mark chapter 9, it reads as follows. When they came back to the disciples, which were the 9, they saw a large crowd around them and some scribes arguing with them. Immediately when the entire crowd saw him, meaning Jesus, they were amazed and began running up to greet him. And he asked them, "What are you discussing with them?" And one of the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son possessed with the spirit, which makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and stiffens out. I told your disciples to cast it out, but they could not do it." And he answered them and said, "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me." They brought the boy to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit threw him into a convulsion, and falling to the ground, he began rolling around and foaming at the mouth. And he asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" He said, "From childhood. It has often thrown him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the boy's father cried out, some translations say weeping, and said, "I do believe, help me in my unbelief. I do believe, help me in my unbelief." When Jesus saw that the crowd was rapidly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out of him, and do not enter him again." After crying out and throwing him into terrible convulsions, it came out. And the boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him, and he got up. And when he came into the house, his disciples began questioning him privately, "Why could we not drive it out?" And Jesus said to them, "This kind cannot come out but by anything but by prayer." And some scribes have added in there by prayer and fasting, but the idea of prayer and fasting, in this case, fasting is not in the text. It's something that was added by a scribe later on. And that kind of becomes important to some people because I think sometimes we misread what that text is saying. So let's kind of see the scene here. So Jesus comes down off of the mountain, and his 9 disciples find themselves very inept to be able to cast the spirit out of this man's son. And the scribes and the Pharisees, kind of like Aaron was and the religious or the leaders at the time with Moses, they're down there stirring up the people, and they're bickering and fighting and arguing with the disciples at their ineptness. Jesus comes upon this scene that's just chaos. It's just mayhem. And as Jesus walks up, it's interesting because it says, and they were amazed to see him. And they were amazed to see him. So they ran up to him, and Jesus said, "What's going on?" And it's interesting that they would say that they were amazed to see him, and it kind of makes you kind of think about it in a couple of different ways. Were they amazed to see him because Jesus always shows up at the right time? Or were they amazed to see him because there was something from his transfiguration on the mountain that caused him to glow, to have a new countenance, the same way that Moses, when he came off of Mount Sinai, had the glory of God on his face? And we really don't know. But the idea, they're amazed to see him. And it's interesting because Jesus at this point is not omnipotent, as you can see here, because he says, "Well, how long has this condition been with the boy?" The father explains it. He said, "Well, it's been with him since his youth." And so Jesus is talking with them, and when he finds out that the disciples they can't cast out the demon. He says, "Oh, you perverse generation, how long shall I put up with you?" And you can almost sense this frustration in Jesus' voice. But then there's this interesting conversation that happens between Jesus and the Father. And the Father says, if you can, you can deliver him by the Spirit from the evil spirit of space, or from, really, I guess you could even say it might be epilepsy, and it probably was epilepsy. And so he says, if you can do something for us, it would be greatly appreciated. And Jesus looks at him and he says, what do you mean if I can't? Right? And he says, don't you understand that with faith, all things are possible with God? And that is the interesting thing, because he's going to combine the idea and the action of faith with the possibility of what it is that God can do. And the man then, in probably a very emotive sense, says, I believe, Jesus, but help me in my unbelief. And that's a very interesting statement if you think about it. I believe, help me in my unbelief. Well, what's that man saying? And I want to talk a little bit about that for a moment, because that is really the crux of the theological point that I really want to bring forward. There's many in this text, but this is one that I want to bring forward when we talk about the idea that Jesus is teaching his disciples. He's teaching his disciples a couple of things here. Number one, the importance of belief and the possibility of God. And number two, what we're going to see later, is the place of prayer and why prayer is important when it's coupled with faith. And these two become a big interaction. So we have a man here that wants his son healed. And so he's coming to Jesus rather than saying, I know you can, and we've heard that in the past of people saying, I know you can, so would you please heal? And here he's asking, he's almost, not sure Jesus can do it. And he says, if you can. And Jesus says, wait a minute, this isn't an if proposition here. I can. But the barrier right now isn't me, it's you. Because if you have faith, then all things are possible with God. And Jesus is asking him, in one instance, where's your faith? And this man says one of the most interesting statements that is so profound. He says, I believe, help me in my unbelief. I have faith, help me in my absence or lack of faith, unfaith. And I find that interesting because I think that we find that exact same thing in all of us, don't we? We believe in some ways, but then we disbelieve in other ways. So we believe, but there's other areas that maybe we don't believe in. And I was thinking about, today when Penn and I were walking, I was thinking about how can I explain this to you. And I got to thinking about using the analogy of twins. And the reason that I want to say twins is because we started talking about when Jesus said, if any man come after me, let him deny himself, pick up his cross, and follow me. And preceding that, before he said that, remember that we saw in Peter, we saw this brilliant Peter, and in some cases this foolish Peter. So you remember when we were talking about it, and he says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus says, blessed are you, Peter. He says, for flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Then Jesus tells him that he's going to go suffer many things at the hands of the scribes and Pharisees, and he's going to ultimately die and raise again in 3 days. And then the foolish Jesus comes and says, no, Lord, may it never be. And Jesus then turns on Peter and says, get thee behind me, Satan. Now, notice what he says. You're no longer looking out for the will of God, but for the will of man. You're looking out for your own will. So we see in Peter, we see these two personalities, right? We see this one that understands the divine revelation, and this other one that is self-serving, and in some cases, I don't know what you call it. I mean, it's almost like usurping. It's almost that voice of the serpent of, no, Lord, you really don't have to do that. It's almost this voice of sentimentality. But there's this brilliance in Peter, and then there's this buffoonery that we see in Peter. And I got to thinking about that in Peter, he has a set of twins. And in the same cases, this man has a set of twins living within his mind. Well, how does that work? Most of us probably know and or have friends that are maybe identical twins. And so it might be two male twins, and if they're identical twins, it's very hard to tell which one is which one. So it's like, if you're a girl in junior high school or high school, and you have a thing for one of the twins, it's almost like, well, how do you know which one is which? Because they both look the same. So let's say you've got one that's named Darren and one that's named Daryl, and you go up to Darren and say, "Gee, I'm really interested in you. Would you be interested in going out to get some ice cream with me someday?" And Daryl says, "No, I'm not really interested in going." So then maybe you just go ask Darren, because you're thinking to yourself, well, they're kind of both the same people, aren't they? You have Daryl and Darren. I mean, they look exactly the same. So the assumption that you make about that is they are identical. They are the same. Or in other words, you think they act like one another, think like one another, and don't have their own personalities, their distinct personalities. And nothing is further from the truth. I had some good friends that I was growing up, and they were twins. And I want to tell you, they were worlds apart. They were actually even in their looks, but even in their personality, they didn't think the same. They didn't look the same. They didn't act the same. And they didn't have the same values, although they had many of the values the same. And they didn't have the same taste in men or cars or whatever the case might be, because there was these two separate personalities. But the mistake we make sometimes is we don't distinguish between these two personalities that are in us, in our mind, and in the way we think. In the case of Peter could think brilliantly about the revelation of God, couldn't he? And then with this other twin that was in him, this other personality that was within him, he basically usurped that which he knew before when Jesus told him ultimately what was going to happen, and he became self-serving. So in this range then of Peter, you have this one that can reach the loftiness of God, and this other one of the ignorance of man. And they're both there in Peter. And so we talked about this, about both good residing in us and evil residing in us. And in this case, both the revelation of God, or seeking the things in the will of God, and then also being self-seeking and seeking these things that we want. And that's that world that we live in and that we wrestle with in our Christian faith. Of, how do we know which one do we want, and which ones take the dominant role? And sometimes one takes a dominant role other than others. So we have this same twin-like mindset, or this twin personality, even within ourselves, when we're thinking about the area of faith. This man loved his son. I don't know if his son was 5 years old, 10 years old, or 30 years old. The text doesn't say that. But for a long time, the man had been putting up with this. And for a long time, the man was probably brokenhearted over the condition of his son, and he just wanted him healed. But he'd probably been to doctors. He'd probably been to other people that had maybe tried to cast out demons. And surely he met with disappointments when the disciples of Jesus Christ couldn't do anything for this child. So he's kind of at the end of his wits, and he's basically saying, maybe I don't think there's anybody that can help my son. There's nobody there that can help my son. And Jesus shows up at the right time. He comes onto this scene when this man is caught in this turmoil. He says, what's going on here? And the man tells a story and says, and if you can you free him from this infirmity? Jesus then begins to switch here, doesn't he? And he makes the statement about, what do you mean if I can? The question isn't whether I can, because with faith, if you have faith, all things are possible with God. So Jesus is now turning it not to what he can do, but the mind of the man. The mind of the man that's asking for the healing. And I think the man understood exactly what Jesus was saying, and he says, Jesus, I'm caught here. And I'm caught here in this dilemma. Because I want to believe, And I do believe because I've heard what you've done. But I've got this unbelief that goes along with it. And I've got this unbelief because everything I've tried in the past, none of it has ever worked. But I also believe because I've heard the stories of what it is that you've done. Even though I've never seen it, I've heard the stories of what you've done. And so I do believe. So in the midst of this, he finds these twin brothers at odds with one another in his own mind, to some extent. And so he makes this brilliant statement, I believe, help me in my unbelief. And you're going to see this trend throughout the teaching time. I believe, help me in my unbelief. Yeah, think about it by not just with this man, but we saw it with Peter just before that, and we're going to see it with Thomas, doubting Thomas, when he says, "I'm not going to believe that he's resurrected until I put my fingers in his wounds." And afterwards, he believes. It says, and he worships Jesus Christ. And so you see this, I believe, but help me in my unbelief dichotomy that exists in every one of us. Now, what's important here is he goes through and Jesus ultimately heals the child. And as he heals the child and he goes his way, he's walking away with his disciples. And he says to it, and his disciples come to him and say, Jesus, why couldn't we cast that demon out? And Jesus makes a statement, well, that's because this kind can only come out, or this infirmity can only come out with prayer. What does that mean? We have a man that was lacking in faith to some extent, but had faith. But before that, nobody could cast it out. And Jesus says there was nothing really the disciples could do because it came down to prayer. We sometimes have a misconception of what that means. And like I said, scribes have actually put that in some manuscripts. It says these only come out by prayer and fasting. But fasting is not found there. And so when you try to make the account, and this is what we try to do, is if I'm a disciple or I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, if I spend time in prayer and fasting, then I'm going to have the power to heal people. And that has been used oftentimes in the Christian context. But that's not what it means at all. It has nothing to do with the ineptness of the disciples. It has everything to do with the prayer of the man that wants his son healed. You see what I'm making here? That the idea is we can want things, but if we never ask God earnestly for those things, how can we expect him to move sometimes for us? So the prayer isn't connected to the disciples. The prayer is connected to the man in need. Now, why? Why would that be important? Well, it would be important in that prayer situation because his prayer simply is not, if you can do something, then do it, Jesus. He comes around to his point of prayer when Jesus says, well, with faith, all things are possible with God. And so we find in this man this beautiful prayer. And the prayer is, oh God, Jesus, I believe, help me in my unbelief. And so what we have here is we have this conjunction of this prayer of I believe, help me in my weakness, along with the fact of I know you can heal him, and it would be my hope that you can do it. But I waver sometimes in that releases the power of God in the midst of a situation like that. So the thing that Jesus taught them was, in their next valuable lesson, was faith is always coupled with asking. Faith is always coupled with prayer. Faith is always coupled with acknowledging the very presence of God and your need for his divine intervention in your life. And so now we're beginning to see that Jesus is beginning to teach the spiritual principles that they want to use to model that he wants them to use to model their lives as disciples of Jesus Christ. Now, these models are not just for those disciples. They're for us as well. The first one that he's beginning to teach is that he's the Christ. He's the Messiah. And that was with that proclamation, the first thing is understand that he came to explain the Father to us as the truth and to reveal himself to us. The second thing he says is if we want to follow with him, take up our cross and deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. It's the life of self-denial. It's the life of suffering to some extent, of not having all the things that we want, and ultimately leading in the death of our self-centeredness. And now the next principle he's teaching here after they see his glory and ultimately what it is he's going to accomplish, because he taught them that he was going to go to Jerusalem, he was going to suffer, he was going to die, and that he was going to resurrect. So all of a sudden now we've got this idea of truth, of self-sacrifice and self devaluation when it comes to our fleshly wants and desires. We have the idea of Christ dying and his resurrection power. And lastly, the things we're talking about today is we have the idea that faith is one of the primary principles of discipleship that we must know. That without faith, God can do nothing, but with faith, God can do many things. Faith is always coupled with prayer, because faith always looks beyond its capacity to what it is that God can do, not what we can do. And so that type of prayer transcends the fact that the disciples couldn't do it. It transcends the fact that maybe he really didn't have faith until he encountered Jesus. But prayer with faith basically says, I'm looking past my circumstance. I'm looking past my unbelief. I'm asking you to help me with my unbelief. Asking you to heal my son. And Jesus says, the only thing I can do with that kind of faith, as weak and feeble as it might appear, is say yes. So I don't know what kind of a circumstance you're in today. I don't know what you need God to do or not do. All I can tell you this is that if you find yourself in need of the things of God, either now or later in life, in your darkest moments, because this man had to be in a dark place, Jesus becomes a light when we understand that by faith, there's nothing that's impossible with God. If we ask, if we seek, if we knock, and if we believe. And even if our belief isn't complete, even if it's feeble, it's enough for him to work with. I hope that you find yourself, when you find yourself in the midst of needing God's hand, God's touch, that you'll say yes to the principle of prayer. I don't think I want to talk anymore today about that. We'll talk about the next lesson of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ next week. Until then, God bless you. Have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you.